Profesor Uniwersytetu Sunderland, autor m.in. Radio Kontekst, wielu prac poświęconych radiu, ale nie tylko radiu, również mediom cyfrowym. Wystąpi jako pierwsze. Chodzi o to, by zaprezentować pewną perspektywę w świetle również założeń tej strategii Vision 2020 z perspektywy kilku krajów: Polski, Portugalii, Niemiec i Wielkiej Brytanii. Proszę bardzo, pan profesor Guy Starkey.
Dzień dobry, and I'm afraid that's about as far as it goes for the Polish, so thank you to the translators in there. And one thing I can say, of course, is dziękuję to our organisers, fantastic hosts. Thank you for the wonderful hospitality and for the invitation to take part in this very interesting conference today. It's actually my sixth visit to Poland. In fact, a year ago I was here in Krakow as a guest of Crete, so it's great to be back in this lovely city. And what a fantastic time to be in Poland as you celebrate 25 years of the new Poland, so congratulations to you as a country. But I do sincerely thank the organisers for the invitation and for all the arrangements that have been made. But you invited me here to talk about the United Kingdom, so I shall stop talking about Poland and I will start talking about the United Kingdom. I think as our first two speakers have suggested, this is a very important topic, and we've already seen some evidence on screen that perhaps in some ways the United Kingdom is a special case. Let's begin with radio, because of course that is where it all started, and the BBC showing in many ways some very fine examples to the rest of the world back in the 1920s of how to broadcast. And the position of the BBC is still a very privileged and successful one today. But if this is your idea of what the BBC looks like today, then you're mistaken, because actually it's very modern. And I go to conferences and people talk about radio as being an old medium, which always upsets me because it sounds like old is irrelevant. Actually, I talk about radio being an established medium, one of more than 100 years of experience, and one which has adapted over time. And as you can see in the BBC Radio 1 studio, it's very space age almost, very modern and very attractive to the eye and to the camera, because of course radio is no longer, and I think in your own countries too, is no longer just for sound. But here's the BBC very much engaging with young audiences, the young radio audience of today and the more mature audience of tomorrow. And by having a pop music channel for young people called Radio 1, how do the BBC justify this in terms of the public service value that they bring to broadcasting? Well, I've listed there 3 bullet points, and you can see that the public service, in the view of the BBC, around Radio 1, playing pop music all day, we might call it pop music. There are other subgenre, of course, to describe in there, but they have a distinctive music policy. They have a focus on new music, not just following the sales charts, as maybe the commercial channels are doing, and also integrating with the music in ways that will be palatable to a young audience, some speech, including music documentaries, and also health, lifestyle, and social content. And Radio 1 has a big impact among young people. Of course, our young people are accessing music and other media content through diverse platforms and through all sorts of different sources, but Radio 1 has a big impact with youth audiences, and Radio 1 regularly hosts the big weekend, where they take, yes, some bands to a location somewhere in the UK, being very inclusive geographically, and putting on a very good event. And you can see the presenter of the Radio 1 breakfast show, Nick Grimshaw, there, who's actually talking face-to-face with crowds of his listeners. The context in which the BBC runs radio, of course, has been one of monopoly, certainly in official terms, until 1973. So yes, the BBC had a monopoly of radio broadcasting from our own shores until 1973. And then a Conservative government introduced commercial radio to the UK. You can see the map at the top is the map of the first few stations, a network that began as 19 local commercial radio stations as part of a plan for 60 commercial radio stations. Well, the map at the bottom, I'm sure it doesn't show up very well on the screen, but the main point is the dots, because for each dot there is a commercial radio licensee. Just 3 of them national FM licensees, but in the region of 300 licenses to broadcast local or regional commercial radio, well beyond the original proposals for 60 stations. And the regulatory environment has changed too, in that when commercial radio first came to the UK, it was very new to us, and we were, I think, rather concerned about what commercial radio might do. The regulation was very tight to make sure that these new radio companies didn't bring down the quality of that to some extent had been set by the BBC. And over the years since the 1970s, of course, we've seen a progressive relaxation of that regulation in terms of content production, in terms of ownership, which we'll come to in a moment, but also in terms of the requirement to provide public service content, which was actually very strong in the 1970s. And I've written on the content that was produced locally in radio stations around the country to meet targets and quotas and standards set by the regulator of the day. Now the regulation is very light touch, with very few public service obligations on the commercial radio sector. And there was a period when the growth of licensed commercial radio stations was particularly fast. There you see some statistics for a number of different years. I've put in the BBC column 3 figures. First, you see the number of national radio stations run by the BBC, and then the number of regional stations, and then the number of local stations. You can see that the number of BBC stations over the period has not grown dramatically, whereas in the middle column you'll see that the number of commercial radio stations did grow very dramatically indeed. 255 licensees in 2001. It's something like 300 licenses, maybe more now. I've stopped counting. But one thing that has characterized the development of our broadcasting media in the UK as elsewhere is, of course, there's much more competition. And as you can see, radio being delivered in many different ways. The radio in the dashboard of the car now not just tells us what radio station we're listening to, but gives us other data too. It tells us what song is being played. And look in the box on the bottom left-hand corner at the number of different radio brands. The BBC has added to its FM services a range of different digital-only services. And, of course, the commercial sector has come up with some national brands which are available only digitally. The map in the bottom right-hand corner is the map of just one group of commercial radio stations. Our second largest group of radio stations, Bauer Media, own those radio stations. And as you can see, they're branded with local variation and local distinctiveness, preserving the heritage of the originally locally owned stations that Bauer Media is now in control of. And there's another group. There are several groups, but the biggest group, one I must tell you about, is Global Media. And Global Radio has taken a lot of independent, once locally owned stations, inherited the ownership of these stations, and in the last 2 or 3 years has turned these stations through rebranding into quasi-national brands. So you can see that the radio station which broadcast on 106.2 and was branded as Heart is to be heard on all sorts of frequencies across the country. They're local radio stations, but with the same branding and a lot of the programming coming from London. The same has happened to Capital, which was once our second ever commercial radio station in London. Now it is a brand which covers most of the country, not all of the country, like Heart on FM. Because of the great growth of commercial radio licenses in the 1990s, there was a point when, of course, the commercial sector thought that they would overtake the BBC in terms of share of radio listening. And there was a point, you can see it in Q1 of 1996, when the commercial sector did overtake the BBC, and the expectations were that the BBC would be left far behind. But those two lines, they do cross a couple of times, and you'll see on the right of the chart, you will see that in 2000, the BBC managed to recover its leadership in terms of share of radio listening, and I can now tell you that that gap between the BBC and the commercial sector has continued to grow, so that the position today, the first quarter of 2014, is that the BBC's share of radio listening is 54.9%, and the commercial sector, with all of their radio stations and all of their brands and all of the marketing that they do, is still only 42%. And there are reasons for that, which we could talk about on another day. Another surprise I might have for you around the UK is the popularity of DAB, digital audio broadcasting, not DAB+. DAB, we are stuck, I'm afraid, with the original version of DAB, but it's extremely popular. You can see how I've got figures from 2008 and 2014 for comparative purposes. You can see that across all digital platforms, digital listening is now 36.6% of all radio listening. And of the different digital platforms, DAB is the most popular with 23.7%. Listening through the television, yes, 5%. And for a long time, the smallest number for internet, now including apps on mobile phones, that number is suddenly growing, and in the last 2 years has overtaken listening through the TV to 6.4%. And of course, we have our radio listening audience measurement body, Radar, and you can follow links and Google for yourself their own site and find more statistics there. They've got an infographic on the left-hand side of the screen, which shows some interesting facts, like 24 million adults say they have access to a DAB receiver. But I think I must move on, in fairness to my colleagues who also want time to speak to you. And before we finish with radio, let's look at the current position. Let's look at the headline data. You can see that the BBC runs the most popular radio services, the most popular radio brands in the UK. And Radio 2, pop music station, but for an older demographic than Radio 1, is our biggest radio station. Radio 4, the intelligent speech station, is the second largest. And then there's Radio 1 for the young market. And then you can see Heart, with its collection of local and regional FM licenses, all consolidated together, is the biggest commercial radio brand. And on AM only, plus of course digital, Radio 5 Live comes very close behind Heart. And then you can see that you have Capital, a national FM station, Classic FM, and Smooth to complete the picture. Now, let's not forget television, of course, before my time runs out. And there's John Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, who actually didn't, I'm told, really want to start a television service, but I think there were pressures at the time saying it ought to be done. So they began broadcasting an experimental service in 1936, suspended it during the war for obvious reasons, but by 1950, 30 hours per week of television. 1953, our present Queen was crowned, and people went round to the houses of neighbours who had television sets, so they could watch the pictures on the television instead of just hear it on the radio. And by 1955, the BBC's output on a single channel had grown to 50 hours per week, and there you see the metamorphosis of the BBC and its television transmissions over the years. And competition came to the BBC in the field of television much earlier than in radio. You can see that the BBC monopoly of television ended in 1955, and what was created in competition with the BBC was a network of independent licensees, a colourful map, each one of those companies being separate from the others, but they shared programming, but they did have their own regional identities. And of course, things have changed because we have this multi-channel multiverse in which we now operate. And just look at all those TV choices that viewers are faced with. And of course, there are many more too. A reminder, though, that we don't just have the BBC for public service television broadcasting. The BBC is state-owned and licence fee funded, but Channel 4 is also state-owned but advertising funded. And if you were to ask most British people on the street to characterise Channel 4, I think they would probably miss the point that Channel 4 is a state-owned television company there to provide a public service, simply because they see the commercials which fund it on screen and they think it is just like ITV, the largest TV channel, and also like Sky, who produce a number of pay TV channels. And not just the state-owned TV channels have to work under public service obligations, but also the private commercial channels, ITV and Channel 5 do too. They have some public service obligations placed upon them, and you can see from the graphic on the bottom right-hand corner that ITV, even though those original separate companies are now merged mostly into one big one, ITV PLC, they still have an obligation to provide regional evening news programming. It's very much watered down from what it originally was, but it is nonetheless a public service obligation which does provide some regional news in competition with the BBC's regional news. Of course, we have our television audience research organisation too, Barb, and you can follow the links and see what they have to say. But the infographic on the left-hand side of the screen tells an interesting story, which of course we were hearing about earlier, because you can see the comparison between two big Saturday night television programmes, Strictly Come Dancing on the BBC. It's about dancing, it's celebrities, it's excitement, it's phoning in, it's red button interaction, it's tweeting, it's all the things that you would want in entertainment television, but it's produced by the BBC. And it comes right up against the X Factor, which is all those things, but is produced by ITV. So the BBC and ITV, the main commercial channel, head to head in competition terms on a Saturday night. And of course, those people who would wish to detract from the BBC would say, why is the BBC even making such a programme as Strictly Come Dancing? That kind of programming surely should be left to the commercial sector. So if we agree with that, are we saying that the BBC, the public service media, should only make boring programming and leave the exciting programming to the commercial sector? Well, I think not, and a good many people in the UK also think not. Let's look at the headline data for television in the United Kingdom. You can see the reach and the share there for BBC One, the BBC's main channel, doing very well. ITV, good in terms of reach. Share, not so good. BBC Two, also doing very well, and ahead of Channel 4 and Channel 5, and then of course we have many other channels, the biggest audiences for which are ITV3 and ITV2. But the BBC's position in terms of its market share in UK television is strong, and I think strong enough to give the BBC and those of us who support public service media a good deal of confidence around its future. The downward spiral of lack of interest and lack of support in public media, I think it would take a very long time for that to occur in the UK, but we must be on our guard. Of course, we have different delivery platforms. Freeview is the digital terrestrial, mostly free-to-air platform. FreeSat is satellite free-to-air, just an on-screen guide which provides a platform to access the free-to-air channels available, which are also available through pay TV. There's Sky, which has its pay TV offering, very popular, yes, but also the BBC was one of the pioneers behind this technological development of a box which not only combines the digital terrestrial broadcasts for you, but also goes online for you and provides you with access to the online view-on-demand archive material of the main broadcasters. And so looking at some platform data now, as I approach the end of the presentation, you can see that Freeview digital terrestrial broadcast has a very strong uptake. This is an Ofcom survey, and these are adults who say, this is the only platform I use for watching television. So 37%, a good figure, say Freeview digital terrestrial broadcast is the only platform I will use to access television. 31% satellite, so it's maybe FreeSat, but that's quite small, or it's Sky, 31% saying satellite, and 14%, because really for us this is something new, cable, showing some penetration there. Just before I end now, a cautionary tale as we look to the future, which we must all do. One of the BBC's biggest radio and television personalities of the 1970s and 1980s, Jimmy Savile, he's actually passed away now. I am legally free to say whatever I like about Jimmy Savile without fear of any consequences. But as you can see, Jimmy Savile, big flamboyant personality, very much enjoying the company of young people, mainly young girls. And in the last 2 years, we've had a terrible national scandal with many, many allegations of what we now call a new term, historical sexual abuse. Again, some of this abuse on BBC premises by Jimmy Savile and also by other presenters on BBC television who are living and about whom I will say nothing, because against some of them there are legal proceedings currently taking place. But the challenges faced by the BBC right now, the aftermath, yes, of the historic sex abuse scandals, because those who wish to damage the BBC will, be under no illusion, use this in order to attack the BBC. Recent criticisms of the BBC's internal regulator, the BBC Trust, is it an effective internal regulator? It was imposed on the BBC under the last government. There's a new chairman about to be appointed. And as we approach 2017, a very significant date for the BBC, the concerns that will become more acute over the next 2 or 3 years around the renewal of its charter. Ever since the 1st of January 1927, the BBC's existence has been made possible and guaranteed by a royal charter renewable every 10 years. So every 10 years they need a new charter. And now, with delivery by non-broadcast means, with the multiverse of multi-platform and multi-channel environment that we have now, might the case for TV licensing be weakened as we come to the renewal of the charter? Maybe even the existence of the BBC will be challenged. I think on the 1st of January 27 we will still have a BBC. We don't quite yet know what size it will be or what activities it will be undertaking. And remember that 7 years ago, the last renewal took place following the worst ever crisis in relations with government and the very critical Hutton inquiry into some of the BBC's coverage of issues around the war in Iraq. Never since the 1st of January 1927, never before had both the chairman and the Director General of the BBC resigned within a 24-hour period. And even in the last few weeks, we have seen an idea coming from the right wing of the Conservative Party that perhaps we should not be criminalising people who don't pay their TV licence anymore. This has gained such strength in our country that legislation is going through to decriminalise not having a TV receiving licence and watching television. It is to become a civil matter rather than a criminal matter. And for me, I think this is a dangerous shift in the legislation around the TV license in the UK. So these are some references that I've used, and once again I'd like to thank you for your attention and say dziękuję.
Dziękuję bardzo. Teraz profesor Uwe Hasenbrink z Uniwersytetu Hamburskiego. Od 1998 roku dyrektor Hans Bredow Institute. Jego zainteresowania badawcze dotyczą polityki medialnej, również korzystania z mediów przez dzieci, młodzież, ale również i z tych mediów, zarówno mediów klasycznych, jak i mediów nowych. Również bierze udział w wielu badaniach dotyczących wykorzystania różnych treści i form przez użytkowników mediów, no właśnie tych online'owych również. You have a floor, Uwe.
Thank you very much, Stanislav. Thank you very much for everybody for the opportunity to speak to you. Let me start with a personal remark. I perceive this situation this morning as a quite heartwarming event. One reason for this is the memory. 25 years ago, I can remember very well carefully reading and watching the news about Poland and the political changes there that caused so many other movements. That was one of my most involved news times I have ever experienced, even before the other times with the Berlin Wall. The other thing I have to say, thank you for the EBU presentations. This is also very heartwarming as somebody who has the impression that public service media is an indispensable part of any communication system. This is actually heartwarming, so if I would not have been convinced before that public service is something good, now I would be convinced finally. Thank you for that. Maybe a first critical feeling coming into the game. I also feel remembered of a conference that I visited 2 weeks ago. It was mainly dealing with Europe and the role of media in Europe. And my impression is I get a little bit mixed up between the two conferences. Talking about public service today seems to be quite similar to talking about Europe today. There are some people for both topics that are highly convinced and engaged and involved in this is a good thing, the best thing we can have in a communication system, public service media, in terms of politics and international cooperation, it's Europe. So there are these heartwarming events where people are really agree very much, this is perfect, we love Europe, we love public service. And at the same time, as Roberto reminded us ourselves, if we go outside, if we go into everyday life, people do not seem to be so involved. They do not seem to be so convinced about both of them. They seem disinterested in a way. In that respect, I really can congratulate the EBU for these efforts to link the idea of public service media with a modern idea, with a fresh idea, with an ambitious idea of that there is something to do. What I'm not now going to do is I'm not trying to provide an overview about the situation of public service in Germany. As you might expect, public broadcasting in Germany, as we have seen from some of the maps shown before, is not in a particular danger. It is one of the countries where public service is in a quite comfortable situation, as long as you do not speak with the persons who are in office. They are obviously complaining on a comparatively high level, in a way. Instead of describing this, I would come to focus myself on some serious challenges and particularly serious challenges in my terms that, or in my impression, that are also relevant for other European broadcasters, and where the German case might be particularly interesting. One bigger story, two short comments. The bigger story is on the question is how big should the range of public service media's online activities be? That is the point, the bigger story. The other two remarks refer to the internal regulation procedures and to reaching young audiences. The German case, in terms of the question, what should public service media, at the time when we started the discussion, was still PSB, public service broadcasters. What should public broadcasters do in the area of online services? We had this famous on European level so-called German state aid case. The background has been in 2003 the Association of Private Broadcasting Companies in Germany. You see the mark Roberto had shown. We have this fine triangle, and then the cam and arrow, a kind of thunderstorm. That side from the competitors, the private competitors, who said, they get license fee, they get state aid for doing something which is our business. So please, European Union, this is against any of your regulation, stop them. After an examination of the German license fee, the Commission regarded these fees as state aid according to Article 87 of EC Treaty. On the basis of this interpretation, such a financing regime must comply with the requirements of Article 86. Thus, a clear remit must exist. This is not bad in itself. However, in the German public broadcasting system, this is a problem. For very bad historical reasons, one of the ingredients of the German public broadcasting system, one of the most important was, public broadcasting is completely independent of the state. So who is entitled to define a clear remit? Who should tell German public broadcasters what the European Commission expected from them? There should be somebody who tells you what to do. That was a complicated situation we were in, and there was a kind of famous compromise. The situation was solved by inventing a kind of procedure. The procedure is called Drei-Stufen-Test, three-steps test. It's an administrative term, I see. What does it mean? Whenever public broadcasters would like to develop or offer a new online service or mobile app or anything today, they have to go through 3 steps. They have to show whether this service is part of the public service mission and thus corresponds with the democratic, social and cultural needs of a society. These 3 terms are laid down in the legal procedures: democratic, social and cultural needs of a society. These are the main reference points. Second step, they have to show whether this new service contributes in a qualitative way to editorial competition, whether it actually stimulates public communication. And finally, they have to make transparent about the money and the expenditure to providing the service. Now it's an important characteristic of the German system. The final decision is not made by any state body. It has to be done by the pluralistic bodies that supervise the German public broadcasters on the basis of public discussion, hearings of the relevant stakeholders, particularly commercial media companies, some scientific expertise that goes into that on the market-related consequences, and so on. So it tries to be the result of a deliberation process, of a societal deliberation process. In order to reconstruct, so what, according to this model, how is the public service remit defined? One step back, Given the dynamic nature of the emerging digital media, there is no chance to define the public service remit by explicitly prescribing which online services public broadcasters may offer or must not offer. There is nobody within the society who could say, I can know what public service should do in 2020. The society has to find out what will be the needs, what will be accepted by the population. In addition, that was the second criteria for the situation, according to the constitutional basis of the German public broadcasting system, the state must not intervene in concrete editorial and organizational decisions. Thus, the definition of the public service remit needs an appropriate procedure, which can be called some kind of regulated self-regulation. Public service media have to develop their objectives as well as criteria, how to assess their success in meeting these objectives by a continuous deliberative process with relevant stakeholders. This is the idea. In terms of Roberto's picture, you would say this idea obviously needs very, very big windows in order to have contact with the society. So far, this seems to be an abstract idea. So far, this seems to be something that is particularly challenging, if not impossible, for the real, actually existing public broadcasters as we know them. They are institutions, they are heavy institutions, they are not very flexible institutions. So how should they manage to do so? This process of defining the public service remit requires that the broadcasters themselves clearly define in which respect the service sets out to contribute to a particularly public value. The notion of public value has become very relevant. One of the concepts that have been borrowed from the UK, mainly from the UK debate as well. So the whole discussion is very much around the concept of public value. And this includes, because nobody from outside can define what public value is, needs public broadcasters define their objectives. They provide indicators that demonstrate that the service has the potential to contribute to this particularly public value. And if the stakeholders accept these indicators and agree that this service actually contributes to the public value, then everything is fine. So this is a kind of complicated procedure to decide upon the public service remit. I'm hesitant which version of the presentation I would prefer to show the next relevant idea, the main point I would like to make. In a project where we try to develop advice for the second German channel, the second ZDF, how to organize this process of continuously providing evidence about public value, we tried to develop a kind of scheme how to proceed, along which a public broadcaster could try to demonstrate this is public value what we offer. The main idea is that in order to provide public value, you need to offer something which has some quality. Quality in terms of a potential for a positive outcome. This is important. Having a good program does not mean that there is public value at the end. It needs further requirements. But it is the first necessary condition. If there is not a good program, there cannot be a good outcome. So first we need quality. The second thing is, if there is quality but no audience, there is no public value. So the second area is we need reach. We need to reach people. And public value at the end is obviously an indicator for impact. Public service, the objective of public service is we would like to have impact on society. A good public communication, a productive, democratic social, culturally productive communication. Okay, going through these steps, I make this very short. I think the main idea should be clear. We go through the three main, as we have seen, the main legally defined values that are important: democratic, social, and cultural value. As a case of accident, the German case, there's also something like a media literacy value. This goes to the direction of innovation in terms of technology, public service as a driver of digitalization, of innovation. For me, this is not that important so far. So we can now go through the levels. The broadcaster has to show that they provide programs that covers political issue, that is diverse, that stimulates participation, for example, or that it's close to the people, it's dealing with everyday issues, it might help conflict solving, it tells us stories about the problems of everyday life, even in TV series and so on. There are cultural issues, there's cultural innovation, cultural memory, and so on. I think you know what it is. Then we have some more comprehensive, not specific quality criteria. We have seen them before. That's very close to the general values that have been presented by the EBU. It has to be understandable, it has to be professional, it has to be relevant, value-oriented, and so on. If you go through this, one condition for REACH is accessibility, barrier-free. The discussion on disabled members of society and so on comes into place. We need use and appropriation. We need the people who actually make use of these programs. So audience research comes into play. And at the end, we can show some indicators. What about the political knowledge in our society? Does public service actually contribute that people know about the European election or how the European Union works or the national government works and so on? And so we can go through these indicators. This again is complicated, but taking up the heartwarming comments, I would say public service deserves a complicated procedure because it's really an ambitious goal. I would like to come to an end. I now miss my challenge 2. Where is it? I just comment on that. One slide got lost. My challenge 2 is related to this. One of the main aspects of the German public broadcasting system is that the society, the pluralistic structure of society, is implemented within the broadcasters themselves. They have a board composed of the different social groups, and as you have seen before, this is the body who has to accept the broadcaster's explanation if a new online service fulfills the public value. Not an external body, an internal body. We have the problem that these internal bodies do not have a very high reputation. Not among politics, not among the broadcasting management, not among the audience. We have had a decision a couple of weeks ago, but the Constitutional Court, which is has been very important regarding the ZDF, where the Constitutional Court said this pluralistic body is it's highly shaped by political, by the governments, and by political parties. This is not allowed according to German regulation and constitution, so please change the structure of this body. This is one small aspect and an important aspect for German public broadcasting, the building of a higher self-confidence of this pluralistic body. They need to demonstrate we are the representation of society within the broadcaster. We are independent of the broadcaster's management. We are independent of the government. We represent society. Otherwise, I would say this whole balanced system cannot work. And the final remark, that was challenge 2 with the pluralistic body, challenge 3. In 2 weeks, I will be on another discussion where related to a project of ARD and ZDF to create something like what they, it's a pity, called a youth channel. It's a perfect idea. Obviously, all the public broadcasters have the same problem. Young audience are not really the fans of public broadcasting. ARD and ZDF have the same situation, and they are planning a youth channel. Unfortunately, they used a concept in Germany, in German language it's still clearer, that they are thinking in terms of a television channel. This is definitely wrong from the very beginning, to my impression. It has to be it is planned as a cross-media approach, online, radio, and television, at least, mobile apps and so on, but they call it like a television channel. And all the comments in the newspapers, the competitors, were saying, oh, these old-fashioned public broadcaster services now again tries to get these young audiences, and their idea is offer them a channel. Don't they understand what young audiences want? They do not want a television channel, they want interaction, they want a platform, they want to have social media applications, they want to have video on demand, and so on. This is actually what they plan, but Roberto's point was communication. It is not correctly communicated. They are regarded, public broadcasting services are regarded as a broadcaster providing old-fashioned linear television content, although they do not do anymore. But still they are regarded like that. So my last sentence would be, efforts and patience is needed to establish a new image, to prove oneself as a relevant communication partner, even for this target group that in these days does not believe that public service is a communication partner. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, Uffe. A teraz profesor Jan Kraft, Uniwersytet Jagielloński, przewodniczący Rady Nadzorczej Polskiego Radia Gdańsk, autor świetnej pracy na temat ewolucji strategii transmedialnych korporacji międzynarodowych, prezes Instytutu imienia Eugeniusza Kwiatkowskiego. Bardzo proszę. The last.
Okay.
Or there.
Okay.
It's the problem. Sorry.
It's no problem. Okay, back again. That's right.
Take it.
Okay. Pragnę Państwa zająć chwilkę sprawami radia regionalnego, ponieważ jako rodowity Kaszub będę mówił w swoim ojczystym języku, więc nie będzie problemu, jak sądzę, tłumaczenia przynajmniej w jedną stronę. A specjalizuję się w zarządzaniu mediami, tym się zajmuję od kilkudziesięciu lat, stąd chciałbym się z Państwem podzielić kilkoma refleksjami na ten temat. A postanowiłem je uporządkować w dosyć lakoniczny sposób. Najpierw pragnę Państwa uwagę zająć przede wszystkim środowiskiem chaosu. Tak za Josephem Nye'em uważam dzisiejszy stan rzeczy. Na temat erozji modeli biznesowych w drugiej części, na temat lokalnych szans i światowych zagrożeń w części trzeciej. Środowisko chaosu. To będą myśli nieuporządkowane, ale uważam, że chyba ważne dla tego, co Michael Porter nazywa otoczeniem strategicznym organizacji medialnych. I nie będę się zajmować tymi twardymi sprawami, tylko troszkę miękkimi. Tą trzecią siłą, tymi miękkimi elementami uwodzenia w środowisku medialnym. Na przykład tym, że trzecim językiem dla bardzo wielu młodych ludzi za chwilę będzie język oprogramowania, niekoniecznie łacina, niestety. Prawdopodobnie też nie filozofia, jako pierwsze miejsce pierwszy temat zainteresowania. A to uwodzenie tego środowiska, tych młodych ludzi, o których tak bardzo będziemy za chwilę zabiegać, bo to oni będą, gdy dorosną, decydować o przyszłości mediów publicznych, no ma różne także oblicza. To uwodzenie oznacza, że rzeczywistość jest nieciekawa. To ten świat uwodzi ich w inny sposób niż nas. Punkt trzeci. Zapomnijmy o tym jednokierunkowym komunikowaniu. Ja wiem, że to jest banalne, ale to jest tak fundamentalne, że trzeba o tym powiedzieć dzisiaj wprost. Czasy, gdy myśmy mówili, a odbiorcy zachowywali się jak krówki Boże, oglądając, słuchając i czytając, naprawdę mijają. Chociaż nie przeceniłbym tego, że ta komunikacja odchodzi gwałtownie w przeszłość. Nie. Aktywnych użytkowników w internecie jest od 10 do 12%. W Polsce być może najlepsze szacunki mówią o 15%. Tych, którzy coś więcej robią niż tylko przewijają. W związku z tym znakomita większość nadal ogląda, nadal słucha, nadal czyta. Ale ta nowa rzeczywistość uwodzi. Może w przewrotny sposób można to w ten sposób zaprezentować. To jest wspólne doświadczenie. To nie jest doświadczenie tylko Niemców i Brytyjczyków. To jest wspólne doświadczenie także Polaków i wszystkich tych, którzy dzisiaj migrują do na wielką scenę mediów interaktywnych. Towarzyszy tym problemom ten to dosyć banalny, ale także dla nas fundamentalny, dla środowiska polskiego problem, czyli abonamentu. Jego fluktuacji, jego uzależnień od decyzji czasami niekoniecznie merytorycznych. Nie będę się rozwodzić na ten temat. Jak Państwo, jak sądzę, jestem o tym przekonany, doskonale zdają sobie sprawę, jaki jest stan rzeczy, ale należy to przypomnieć. A teraz chciałem powiedzieć o czymś chyba istotnym, co z mojego punktu widzenia stwarza pewne istotne nadzieje. Świat się błyskawicznie zmienia. Ja sięgnąłem 10 lat w przeszłość. Postanowiłem zrobić małe resume tego, jak bardzo się zmienia. I to, co dla mnie jest szczególnie istotne, to, że mamy do czynienia z pewną erozją fundamentalną źródeł wartościowych informacji. Ta wielka gazeta wyborcza, która trzymała rząd dusz w latach 90. w Polsce, w ciągu ostatnich lat straciła 61% osób, które chciałyby ją kupić w wersji papierowej. Jeżeli sądzimy, że wszyscy przeszli do internetu i zamienili źródło informacji, to nie jest prawda. W internecie się wersje online tradycyjnych gazet niespecjalnie sprzedają. Nie chcemy płacić. Żyjemy w kulturze darmowości, żyjemy w kulturze wymiany, ale nie płatności. Jak napotykamy jakąkolwiek formę płatności, natychmiast omijamy ją. Myk. Młodzi ludzie są w tym znakomici, a my się uczymy za nimi. Magazyny opinii. Problem jest jeszcze poważniejszy, przynajmniej dla niektórych tytułów. Te, które otrzymywały odpowiednie kwoty jako fundament ich przyszłego bytu, doświadczają erozji tego wszystkiego, co się nazywa stabilizacją finansową. Prasa regionalna, i tutaj zmierzam do tego, co chyba zasługuje na końcu na nazwę konkluzji, ma się jeszcze gorzej. Tu jest prawdziwy problem. Tu jest prawdziwy problem, jeżeli traktujemy prasę jako źródło regionalną wartościowych, intrygujących i sprawdzalnych z punktu widzenia jakości dziennikarstwa informacji. Każdy z Polaków mógłby doszukać się swojego tytułu, którego jego mama, jego tata, jego dziadek, jego babcia czytali, ustawiając się swego czasu w kolejce do do kiosku ruchu. Dzisiaj to jest walka o byt, bo za chwilę jest breakpoint, za chwilę jest punkt przecięcia, że już nie ma stabilizacji finansowej. Jak nie ma stabilizacji finansowej, nie ma możliwości podtrzymywania systemu, w którym płaci się za dobrą, sensowną pracę dziennikarzy. Na szczęście w mediach publicznych nie mamy, można powiedzieć paradoksalnie, problemu publicznej prasy. Ale mamy zupełnie inny problem, absolutnie fundamentalny. To jest problem jakości. To jest jakości. Bo słabość tradycyjnych mediów, tych bardzo ogólnie pojętych, oznacza po prostu gorszą jakość. Punkt drugi. Erozja modeli finansowych. No to już mamy element wprowadzenia do tego fundamentalnego problemu. Opłata za treści? Nie. Ja nie chcę płacić. Model reklamowy? Nie chcę oglądać reklam. To przepraszam bardzo. To jak media mają funkcjonować? Nie ma darmowych obiadów. Milton Friedman to dawno powiedział. W mediach też to się sprawdza. Skoro nie ma darmowych obiadów, no to nie ma darmowych, wysokiej jakości produktów. Nie chcą oglądać. Idą na kawę, na herbatę, z psem na spacer, kończy się blok reklamowy, wracają. Tutaj akurat wątek telewizyjny, ale radiowy jest analogiczny. Każdy z szefów rozgłośni regionalnych doświadcza tego. Im wyższy poziom bloków reklamowych, udziału bloków reklamowych w tym konkurowaniu, a media nadal publiczne konkurują, ale o uwagę odbiorcy, czy też aktywnego użytkownika. Otóż każdy doświadcza, że im więcej bloków reklamowych, tym jest problem z jakością tego, co nazywamy generalnie misją. Minęło tylko 10 lat. Pojawiło się mnóstwo marek uwodzących czytelników, widzów, słuchaczy. Uwodzących. Dzisiaj w tym roku obchodzimy 10-lecie urodzin Facebooka. Za chwilę, w przyszłym roku będziemy obchodzili następne. Nie wszystko się sprawdza, ale wszyscy jak jeden mąż dążymy w jedną stronę. Zapakujemy swoje wielkie wozy doświadczeń, dziennikarstwa wysokiej jakości i podążamy w stronę społeczeństwa cyfrowego, ku nowym mediom. Ale tam są Indianie, tam są wielkie amerykańskie korporacje, tam są same problemy. Opuszczamy bezpieczny byt. Wszyscy nie. Paradoks polega na tym, że chociaż poobijani, chociaż będący pod wpływem przeróżnych sił, media jednak publiczne dość bezpiecznie idą w tą stronę, aczkolwiek nie bez problemów. To jest zapis z początku, myślę, że bardzo ważnego dzieła, jakie się ukazało w ubiegłym roku, Handbook of Social Media Management. Alan Albaran, którego kompetencji, jak sądzę, nie wolno nawet podważać, guru zarządzania mediami, mówi dzisiaj tak: nadal żadne stare medium, żadna większa bądź mniejsza firma, a raczej przedsiębiorstwo medialne nie znalazło sposobu na to, nie znalazło modelu biznesu, czyli sposobu zarabiania w nowych mediach. Bo to Facebook, ani Google, ani Facebook, ani Twitter, ani Pinterest, ani wiele innych nowych marek nie wymyślono w starych mediach. One powstały obok, jako potrzeba, jako forma zaspokojenia potrzeby czegoś więcej niż tylko odbioru. Jakie widzę szanse zagrożenia w tej sytuacji, która wydaje się na swój sposób beznadziejna? One są dosyć rozmaite. Wydaje mi się, że pojawiła się w obliczu tego, co nazywam abdykacją komercyjnych mediów z dostarczania wartościowych produktów medialnych. W obliczu tego, co nazywam nadal istniejącym ważnym popytem na wysokiej jakości treści medialne. On nie zniknął. Dostawcy podlegają erozji. Słabości merytorycznej, informacyjnej, portali medialnych dostrzegam pewną lukę, duże pole do popisu. Nigdy nie było tak dobrze w sytuacji tak trudnej. Jestem o tym przekonany. W ciągu 20 ostatnich 5 lat Nie było równie ciekawych, intrygujących. Bardzo przepraszam. To od podmuchów. Nigdy nie było tak intrygujących wyborów strategicznych. Wybory strategiczne, misja w dosyć oczywistej postaci w starych i nowych mediach, plus dostarczanie wysokiej jakości. To jest ta szansa. Tylko pytanie, czy to ma być interaktywne. To kusi. Jesteśmy poddawani takiej retoryce, takiej ogólnoświatowej retoryce, że jak nie wejdziemy do tego pociągu, który pędzi w stronę nowych mediów, no to o coś będziemy ważnego ubożsi, coś się ważnego, złego wydarzy. Problem jest fundamentalny. Kolejny fundamentalny problem. Dlatego owszem, content is king. Treści są najważniejsze. Ciekawe treści budzą także w nowych mediach wielkie zainteresowanie, natychmiast ogniskują uwagę, a nie tylko banalne soft news. Problem w tym, że zarabia kto inny, bo ten świat już jest zagospodarowany. Proszę zobaczyć taki slajd, który ilustruje, co się wydarzyło, gdy Polska grała z Rosją w 2012 roku na Euro 2012. Czerwona linia pokazuje oglądalność meczu, a zielona pokazuje aktywność na mediach społecznościowych. Gol, natychmiast rośnie aktywność i tak dalej. Kończy się mecz, rośnie aktywność na mediach społecznościowych. Ale gdzie? Na Facebooku. To nie jest europejska marka. To jest ponadnarodowa korporacja, która nie płaci w Europie podatków. Polskie inwestycje w mecz i transmisje z meczu, ale amerykańskie korzyści. To są te marki, które uwiodły. Problem nie dotyczy tylko Polski. 80% spośród najpopularniejszych stron w Europie należy do korporacji amerykańskich. Żadna z najpopularniejszych amerykańskich w Ameryce nie należy do europejskich. Coś ważnego się wydarzyło w ciągu ostatnich kilkunastu lat. Robert Levin nazywa to jazdą na gapę. Bo to, co jest cool, niestety nie jest europejskie. Mówię to świadomie w kontekście rozwoju mediów publicznych. Cool, jazzy, trendy, to jest ten język przyszłych odbiorców mediów publicznych. Być może oni będą dojrzalsi. Być może wrócą do świadomego, do wartościowego oglądania, słuchania mediów publicznych. A być może nie. Tego nie wiemy. Dopiero minęło 10 lat. Onet. Najpopularniejszy polski portal internetowy. 386 milionów odsłon w ciągu miesiąca. Onet jest agregatorem. Onet zarabia na nas, na mediach publicznych. To my dostarczamy te treści. Znacząca część tych treści w głównej części Onetu jest autorstwa na przykład Informacyjnej Agencji Radiowej w Polsce. Misja. Musimy być w tej sieci. Jesteśmy na to skazani. No way, nie ma innego wyjścia. Ale Indian jest wokół bardzo wiele. I nasze bydło, które prowadzimy, jest skazane na coraz więcej różnych zagrożeń. Nie wymyśliliśmy tego Facebooka, nie wymyśliliśmy agregatorów i prawdopodobnie nic się w najbliższym czasie nie zmieni. Czy jesteśmy aktywni? Najpopularniejsze witryny internetowe w Polsce. Gorąco zwracam Państwa uwagę na odsłony krajowe ogółem. nie jest dobrze. Coś odjechało, coś się wydarzyło. Nie tylko w wartościach symbolicznych, ale także w bardzo wymiernych. W kategorii biznes, finanse, prawo nie ma mediów publicznych w 10. Propozycja. No, skoro tak narzeka, no to być może coś zaproponuje. Ja nie wiem, czy to jest święty Graal, ale wydaje mi się, że należy coś ważnego zrobić i coś się z tym uporać. To jest owoc naszej dyskusji z prezesem Radia Gdańsk, obecnym tutaj Lechem Parelem. Postanowiłem to zapożyczyć i pomyślałem sobie, chyba warto się nad tym zastanowić. Jako jedna z propozycji. Może to jest wartościowe. Skoro 500, 600 nadal wartościowych dziennikarzy przynajmniej pracuje w mediach regionalnych w całej Polsce, którzy dostarczają unikatową treść, zawłaszczaną, przepraszam za to mocne słowo, przez agregatory w postaci Onetu, Wirtualnej Polski i tak dalej, przy bardzo wielkiej słabości portali regionalnych, nie liczę Trójmiasta, akurat mamy wyjątkowego konkurenta w postaci trójmiasta.pl, to coś tym fantem trzeba zrobić. I trzeba to zrobić roztropnie. Nie wolno pędzić z tymi krowami do tych Indian za szybko. Robert Picard, którego także przywołuje, mówi tak, no trzeba się powstrzymać od szybkiego zaciągnięcia dojnej krowy, jaką są media tradycyjne do rzeźnika. Nie wolno porzucić to, co jest dobre w imię tej retoryki, że nowe musi być znakomite. Nie. Trzeba to zrobić roztropnie, spokojnie i uważnie analizować, co się wydarzy. Toulouse Salomat, pierwsza fińska gazeta, która rzuciła się w tamtą stronę dawno, prawie 20 lat temu, poniosła klęskę. Spadek przychodów reklamowych okazał się znacznie wyższy niż potencjalne korzyści wynikające z tego, że wszystkie treści przeszły natychmiast do internetu. I to była wielka przestroga dla wielu innych. Skoro jesteśmy zatem nieco zapóźnieni, no to uczyńmy z tej wady siłę. Być może coś się wydarzy dobrego. Bo konsekwencje tego, że się zbyt szybko ściągniemy tą krowę do rzeźnika, mogą być fatalne. Po pierwsze, trzeba porzucić przyjemność komunikowania jednokierunkowego. My z zadartymi nosami wiemy, jaka jest rzeczywistość, a wy słuchajcie. W internecie radio może konkurować niestety aż z 300 000 stacji radiowych na całym świecie. I tych małych, i tych wielkich, i tych internetowych, i tych mniejszych. To jest świat kompletnej dystrakcji uwagi. Iluzja ochrony praw autorskich. Tam nie ma bezpieczeństwa. Internet jest sferą dzielenia się. To jest taka retoryka kolejna. Dzielenia się. Dawniej się mówiło wśród przyzwoitych ludzi kradzież. Ja być może przerysowuję, ale wskazuję niebezpieczeństwo. Jeżeli do tego dochowamy, mamy szansę. Mamy szansę. To była propozycja jedna z wielu. Bardzo pięknie dziękuję.
Dziękuję bardzo. I last but not least, profesor Paula Cordeiro, Uniwersytet Techniczny z Lizbony.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm the last one, but actually Stanislav wanted me to be the first one. He's a gentleman as always. I thank that very much. But due to this sort of Apple universe, I'm stuck with the Apple computer, and I do have to make my presentation from here. So I'll be talking to you about the public service media in Portugal particularly, and I will be focusing on radio, since I've been working as a radio researcher for quite a while, and currently I'm the ombudsperson for radio in RTP. My presentation will be organized in three parts: the history, the context, and the challenges. And I will be talking to you a little bit about the history so that you can totally understand what kind of challenges RTP has currently. It all started back in 1935 when the government decided to create Emissora Nacional. In English, it would be the national broadcaster. And Emissora Nacional was created most of all during an authoritarian regime, and back then the objective was to promote the government objectives through broadcasting news, some culture, and above all, entertainment, in a sort of a Roman Empire and Julius Caesar objective of bread and circus. So did our government back in early 30s, in last century, decided to do more or less the same with a sort of a triangle that has been in our culture for ages. Fado, the music gender, football, and Fatima. Fatima meaning religious views and religious practice in the Catholic Church. But this Emissora Nacional promoted culture also through an orchestra and training new musicians and a training center for radio. It evolved through time, and in the 50s we had again Emissora Nacional, but the training center became a university radio, not broadcasting as a radio university, but becoming a radio center for training new people coming into radio, new professionals for radio in Portugal. And back then we were also broadcasting in shortwave for African colonies. Later on, during several years, we did that and we expanded a worldwide shortwave coverage. But back then, so that you can understand the radio context in Portugal, we had Emissora Nacional with one channel, and we had Radio Renascença, a Catholic Church broadcaster that was created back in 1937. And these were the two national broadcasters. We then had also some local broadcasters, but it was very, very hard to get a radio license. Whether you were part of the government or you were very well connected with the government to achieve a radio license. Otherwise, it was absolutely impossible, because radio broadcasting was considered to be something provided by the state and the Catholic Church. Back in the 70s, we had the democratic revolution in Portugal in 1974. Back then, we still had Emissora Nacional, but the military force get into the Emissora Nacional and control it, and later on it became something else that we'll talk to you about. In 1974, the military forces leading the democratic revolution also decided to nationalize all private broadcasters and included them on the Emissora Nacional. So what happened between 1974 and 1976 is that Emissora Nacional became Radiodifusão Portuguesa, meaning, well, it doesn't have a direct translation to English, but it's more or less like Portuguese radio broadcasting, so that you can understand. It's RDP, and RDP gathered a lot of local radio channels, and so it was very hard to manage, not only because we were in a very controversial period because of all the changes in the government and actually going through an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, and all the mess this gets into the society. But in RDP it was very, very hard to manage, with several managers coming on board, because there was this conflict between the military and the radio professionals. Back in 1993, RDP needed to be restructured, reorganized, and to reposition itself. It was very hard to manage such a huge number of radio channels, and it was such a confusion on the company that they decided to restructure it. But I also must explain something else. Between 74, well, between 1975, more or less, and 1988, we had a deregulation period in our country that allowed many pirate radio stations to become radio stations. And so what happened is that we had a lot of radio stations broadcasting simultaneously and over frequencies. What happened is that you were trying to tune a RGP radio station or a Catholic Church Renascença radio station, and you were not able to get it with a proper signal because there was a pirate radio broadcasting over that frequency. And so in 1989, there was this Radio Act providing a new law for radio and legalizing a lot of radio stations. We had back then the legalization of 300 radio stations, local radio stations in all the country. So in 1994, due to this reorganization of RDP, we had new channels. What happened in 1993 is that we had one sort of a private radio station inside RDP, the Radio Comercial, commercial radio, it's exactly the name of the radio station. This was the only radio station with advertising. And so they decided in 1994 to privatize Radio Commercial. And so Radio Commercial got back to his former owner, Radio Club Português, Portuguese Radio Club. It was the owner of this channel, and in 1994, the RDP decided to give it back to the former owner, and so Radio Comercial is currently privately held radio station with advertising. And so in 1994, due to this reorganization in RDP, there were new channels created, meaning one youth-oriented channel and another channel oriented to our African community in Lisbon that currently broadcasts in Lisbon in also other parts of the country, not nationwide. In 1998, during the Expo 98 in Lisbon, RDP decided also to invest in DAB, but it wasn't that great of investment. I will tell you more about lately. Then in 2000, the company decided to become Portugal Global Portugal. And so it gathered the public television, the public news agency, and also radio. But this didn't work very well. It was a huge mess within the public media sector. And so in 2002, the Portugal Global was abandoned, and they created RTP, Rádio e Televisão de Portugal, radio and television. And so since then, we have been struggling to deal with radio and television in just one company, because formerly we had RDP, radio broadcasting, and RTP, television broadcasting, two different companies, but also public companies. And then we had the news agency called Lusa. So in 2000, they decided to congregate everything. And then in 2002, they decided that the news agency should be just the news agency as itself, a different company, and radio and television should be in one place and one single management team. Didn't work very well, and 10 years after, I will tell you what had happened. But in 2012, we decided at RTP to end up with the DAB investment and decided to stop broadcasting in DAB and also to stop broadcasting in shortwave. As the ombudsperson, I got a lot of complaints about the shortwave, but it's a decision that the Board of Administration took, and it's not reversible. So, between 2012 and 2014, I must say that there's been a huge discussion in the country about RTP. RTP has been in the center of public discussion about possible privatization of the company, possible privatization of one TV channel, maybe even one radio channel, private management, a sort of a concession to a private group, or just create new bylaws to organize this public company. What I can tell you is that currently we are at RTP expecting the definition of the new bylaws because they are waiting for the Parliament approval. So this is the context, the historical context, so that I can explain a little bit why this. This happens because we had 40 years of an authoritarian regime with censorship, a lot of fear in radio professionals. People were actually afraid of doing different things because they could get arrested. And sort of an old school tradition of doing radio, very conservative, with no innovation and not a very good adjustment to the audience needs. It was that idea that we, public service, provide the content that you, the audience, are due to accept. But things have been changing. And so we had also 15 years of deregulation. And after that, we had this trend of formatting radio stations inspired by what happened in the US and also a little bit inspired of what happened in the UK. So private radio stations decided to get a specific radio format, and the most successful ones are the music formats targeted at a top 40 and a young generation. But we had also a new generation of radio professionals coming into radio that changed a lot of the mindset of this idea of old school of conservative radio production. And of course, all that relates with digitalization of production and distributing the content. So currently, today, we have this identity problem at RTP. There's a constant internal dissolution, people discussing what RTP should or should not be. But there's also political interference, not in terms of editorial content or editorial decisions, but the fact that the government doesn't decide and doesn't define what's supposed to be RTP as a public company, what kind of channels should have or should not have, what kind of bylaws should have or should not have. This has been considered as a political interference because the company is stuck with this undefinition and unable to accomplish its own objectives. And of course, as everywhere else, financial struggle, doing, as Roberto said, doing more with less. But today we also have this digital challenge. And this digital challenge has a lot to do with what actually people think about the public service mission. Audiences are not aware of what kind of mission public service must accomplish and why. But also the radio competition, which is very, very strong in our country, and the fact that private broadcasters do much better than the public broadcaster in terms of audience ratings. And also some issues regarding the digitalization of technical resources and human resources that haven't been able to adjust themselves to this new digital context. Sorry. So for public service radio, I should say that the challenges are in fact regarding the objectives of public service radio, and of course the mission of delivering this content to people. But also considering what kind of functions should public service radio have in our society and what kind of values should provide to our society. In terms of public service radio, of course, we all know that public service radio should defend pluralism, should defend minorities, should be independent, should provide diversity, and should be trustworthy, but also promote national culture, national arts and artistic movements, defend and promote technological innovation, and in our particular case, it's mandatory to defend the Portuguese language. That's why we have music quota providing more than 60% of Portuguese music in all channels, with an exception for the classical music channel. Therefore, what the main problem and the main issue right now in public service radio is the lack of audience research. Actually, RTP at this point does have information about audience ratings, but doesn't have market studies, audience studies, qualitative studies that might provide them information to be better in terms of pluralism, in terms of serving minorities, or in terms of, for instance, diversity. But also there's a problem with the organizational culture that has been struggling a lot in terms of trust as a public service company, in terms of independence, for instance. And what I believe is that due to these 2 years of total mess in what the company of like RTP should be, they cannot at this point define their own priorities. So in terms of RTP and public service radio in Portugal, we do have a problem with funding, but also this problem defines some other problems that are not strictly related with funding, but there are consequence of the lack of funding, which is the innovation, the organizational structure of the company, and of course human resources adequacy and new definition of working processes considering the digitalization and the culture in the organization. And all of this is very relevant to what kind of content is being produced, to what kind of distribution is being delivered, and of course getting into the audience, because the audience is more concerned with the content and where to get it from than RTP itself. You all know this image. I took it from the EBU Vision 220 report. Sorry, but it was very interesting. And so I will use it, since this is connecting to the network society and continuous improvement and some sort of recommendation from EBU, I will use it to explain what's being done or what will be done in RTP. So regarding the content and the better understanding of audiences, it's something being discussed, the need for RTP to better know their audiences. But of course, in terms of increased engagement and diversity, I think that this is something that should be discussed in RTP, because what they are doing is developing a quite interesting but only a social media strategy and creating new shows in terms of ensuring diversity. Set priorities in your portfolio. This is very hard to achieve at this point, because the priority is to know, are we going to be privatized? Are we going to have new bylaws? What kind of bylaws will we have in near future? Be the most relevant and trusted source of information. It has been achieved since in the last 2 years, the number one channel, the channels I will show you just after this slide. The channels that we have is Antena 1, Antena 2, Antena 3, and then other channels. But Antena 1 is the former Emissora Nacional, the most important and the most notorious RTP channel. Antena 2 is a classical music channel, and Antena 3 is a youth-oriented channel. So in terms of trustworthiness and information, the growth in ratings in Antena 1 is proven that they are making an effort in this. But in terms of being more relevant to younger audiences, I should say that Antena 3 has known a decrease in audience ratings, which is quite worrying. As for empowerment, curation, and share, I won't say anything. As for acceleration, innovation, and development, is related to prioritizing the portfolio, ensuring preeminence, and transforming organizational culture and leadership style. It's the hardest to achieve due to whatever I already explained, the 40 years of historical issues, the 15 years of deregulation, the different cultures between professionals within the company, and making the case for public service media. Well, they are willing to, digitally speaking. And so setting priorities and accelerating innovation and development are really related, and at this point, not the main concern at RTP, since the main concern is actually to survive this crisis. In terms of public service radio, I should point that actually RTP is definitely going digital. But the problem is that there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of different initiatives with no leadership. And so all these initiatives don't have a coherence. And so they are making a lot of things, doing a huge effort, but it doesn't make sense for the audience, and the audience doesn't know exactly where to find RTP. This is RTP portfolio. I created that line so that you can understand something. On the top, we have the FM channels, also broadcasting online. After the line, we have the the online, web-only radio channels. And right in the middle, we have RDP International. RDP International is the channel broadcasting to all over the world. What happens is that since 2012, when they shut down the shortwave, RDP International became a sort of no one's land, because the only FM broadcasting currently for RDP International is in Timor-Leste, and all the other countries were listening to RDP International through shortwave or satellite on TV or the web. Currently, RDP International is a sort of a hybrid, creating non-linear content in terms of traditional way of doing radio, but being broadcasted particularly online and in FM to only one part of Timor-Leste territory. And so Antena 1, Antena 2 and Antena 3 are the most well-known radio stations for the public channel. Then we have RDP Africa for the African community in Portugal, but also RDP Açores to Azores and Madeira. Then we have channels for fado, channels for dance, channels for rock, channels for memory. It's a channel that was created to complement television series. Then we have opera, Portuguese music only, and so on. As for ratings, this is something that I really want to point out. In green, we have Grupo Renascença, the Catholic-owned radio group. It has currently 4 channels, 2 national channels, RFM and Renascença, and 2 regional channels, Mega Hits and Radio Sim. Then we have privately held radio stations, mostly owned by Media Capital Radios, MCR, which are Radio Commercial, Cidade, M80. And then we have Antena 1, which is held by RTP, Public Service Media. And in terms of share, it's the column in the middle, you can see the difference. The most listened radio, this is not the most listened radio station, it's the station with huge share, the biggest share is RFM, 21.8% of share, as Antena 1 has only 7%. But in terms of weekly reach, Radio Comercial, which is the most listened radio station currently, has a 31.3% of weekly reach against 11.4% of Antena 1 at RTP. And I should say that Antena 1 is the most listened channel of RTP. But in terms of groups, is the second table. In terms of groups, we do have the Renascença group, the Catholic-owned radio group, with 36.7% of share and a weekly reach of 48.6% against 9.7 and 15.9 corresponding to RTP. And this says a lot of the trouble that RTP has been having. This is where we are aiming, not working? Okay, this is where RTP is right now, the website and the pages of radio within RTP website, and this is where also RTP is. An app that is only an app to listen to radio is a different distribution channel not on the web but on an app, but it doesn't actually correspond to the expectations of the audience in terms of app usage. So RTP is trying to create something more engaging for the audiences, something that will reproduce a sort of a activity stream, allowing the listener to communicate with the radio station through texting, through Facebook, through Twitter, or even phoning to the radio station, and also aiming to bring the radio station to the car in a more visual approach. So to conclude, and this is my last slide, I don't have actually conclusions, I do have questions. How to find legal and alternative sources of revenue for public service media, particularly radio, since in our country we do have advertising in one television channel and we don't have any kind of advertising for radio. How to explain to the audience the relevance of public service media. Why are we important? I believe that the audience is not aware of how important public service media is, and how to compete with private broadcasters having lower revenue and stable governance, weak organizational culture, and a lack of technical resources considering the digital. Thank you very much. This was my presentation.